We're about to look at the surprising and direct evidence from the scriptures that solves this ancient mystery. We'll piece together clues from the biblical story, look at the historical context, and even check out ancient traditions that tried to fill in the gaps. The answer is not only biblically sound, but tells us something profound about the beginning of humanity. So stick around as we unravel the story of Cain's wife and the forgotten daughters of Adam and Eve. The first crime, and a puzzling verse. To get to the bottom of this, we have to go back to the scene of the crime. Genesis chapter 4 gives us one of the darkest pictures in the whole Bible. You have the first two brothers, Cain and Abel, sons of Adam and Eve. Cain's a farmer, Abel is a shepherd. Both bring an offering to God. For reasons that theologians still debate, God accepts Abel's offering, but not Cain's. The New Testament book of Hebrews later suggests that Abel's offering was made in faith, while Cain's wasn't. The heart of the matter was the matter of the heart. This rejection sends Cain into a spiral of rage and jealousy. God sees it, and in an incredible moment of mercy, warns him directly. He says, "Why are you angry? If you do not well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." It's a powerful image, sin as a predator, lurking, waiting to pounce. God is giving Cain a chance to master his own darkness. But Cain doesn't listen. He lets the predator in. He asks Abel to go out into a field, and there he kills his brother. It's the very first murder, staining the new earth with blood and shattering the first family. God confronts Cain again. "Where is Abel, your brother?" Cain's reply is chilling. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" The punishment is severe. The ground itself, crying out with his brother's blood, will no longer produce for him. He's cursed, condemned to be a fugitive and a wanderer. Cain immediately panics, crying out, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." This is a huge clue. Cain is afraid of being killed by someone. If the only other people were his parents, who is this whoever he's so afraid of? It's our first hint that the world's population might be bigger than just Adam and Eve. God, showing mercy again, puts a mark on Cain to protect him, promising severe vengeance on anyone who might kill him. And this brings us to the verse at the center of our mystery. Genesis 4, verse 16, says, "Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden." Then verse 17 drops the line that's launched 1,000 questions. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city. Hold on. A wife? Just like that? The story has only named 4 people: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, who's now gone. So where did this woman come from? Did he just stumble upon another tribe of people in Nod? If so, where did they come from? I thought Adam and Eve were the first and only humans. This is where people get stuck. It seems to challenge the whole biblical account of creation. If there were other people, then Adam and Eve aren't the ancestors of all humanity, and the whole theological framework of the fall and redemption starts to look shaky. This isn't a small detail. It's a question that hits the foundation of the story. The Bible tells us that Cain settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. At first glance, that sounds like a specific place on a map. But if we look deeper, the name Nod itself offers a clue that points us beyond geography to something more symbolic. In Hebrew, Nod comes from the root verb nud, which means to wander or to be a fugitive. This is the same root God used earlier when he cursed Cain, saying he would be a fugitive and a wanderer. So when the text says Cain went to the land of Nod, it's clever wordplay. Cain was cursed to wander, so he went to live in the land of wandering. This suggests Nod isn't just a place, but a description of Cain's restless and separated life, a state of exile from God's presence. Eden represented closeness to God, but going east into Nod meant moving away physically and spiritually. The great theologian St. Augustine called Nod a symbol of carnal disquietude, the restless state of those who abandon God.
This shifts our understanding. Cain isn't just moving to a town, he's entering a state of permanent exile, marked by separation. But this raises the famous question: who was Cain's wife? Even if Nod wasn't a nation, Cain is clearly with his wife there. He builds a city, which requires more people than just him, his wife, and their son. So, where did these people come from? The story seems to leave out a crucial piece, or does it? The Bible often hides answers in plain sight, and the key to this puzzle is found just one chapter later in Genesis.
In a verse that's easy to miss but holds the answer. The forgotten verse in Genesis. For all the centuries of debate, the main clue to this riddle isn't buried in some obscure ancient text. It's right there in Genesis, one chapter after Cain's story. The answer has been hiding in plain sight in Genesis chapter 5, verse 4. Genesis 5 is a genealogy, the begat chapter that many of us skim. It traces the family line from Adam to Noah. It starts with Adam, mentions his son Seth, who was born after Abel's death, and then we get this critical line. Speaking of Adam, Genesis 5:4 says, "The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters." Let that sink in. He had other sons and daughters. This one line changes everything. It's the key. The Bible is telling us directly that Adam and Eve's family wasn't just Cain, Abel, and Seth. They had a big family. The common picture of the first family being just two parents and a few sons is a major simplification. To really get this, we have to think on the biblical timeline. Adam lived to be 930 years old. He had Seth when he was 130. That means for another 800 years, Adam and Eve were having children. 8 centuries. That's a massive amount of time for a family to grow. You don't need fancy math, just a little common sense. Even if they had a new child every 10 or 20 years, that would still add up to dozens of children over 8 centuries. And those children would grow up and have their own children, and so on. Cain killed Abel before Seth was born, when Adam was 130. By the time Cain was exiled, a good amount of time could have passed. Some scholars think Cain might have been over 100 years old. In that century, how many brothers and sisters could have been born? At least several. So by the time Cain was ready to marry, the earth wouldn't have been empty. There would have been a growing population of his own siblings. When Genesis says Cain knew his wife, it doesn't say when this happened. It could have been years, even decades after his exile began. By then, the human population, all from Adam and Eve, could have easily been in the dozens, maybe hundreds. This single verse, Genesis 5:4, solves our two biggest problems. First, it tells us where Cain's wife came from. She was one of his sisters, or maybe a niece. She had to be a descendant of Adam and Eve because, at that point, there wasn't anyone else. Second, it explains who Cain was afraid of. He wasn't afraid of strangers from another race. He was afraid of his own family, his brothers or other relatives seeking revenge for Abel. The threat was from inside his own expanding family. The answer is simple, and it comes straight from the text. There were no other races of people. All of humanity, Cain's wife included, came from Adam and Eve. But this answer, as clear as it is, immediately brings up another much more uncomfortable question for us today. An uncomfortable truth. If Cain's wife was his sister, that means the first marriages in history were between brothers and sisters. For humanity to continue, all of Adam and Eve's kids had to marry their siblings. Today, that idea is deeply disturbing. Incest is a universal taboo, and for good reasons. It's morally wrong, and as we now know from genetics, it's biologically dangerous. So how do we deal with this? Does this mean God was okay with something that feels so wrong? To answer that, we have to understand the unique context of creation. First, let's think about genetics. Adam and Eve were created directly by God. Their DNA was perfect, without any of the built-up mutations and defects our DNA carries today. Sin had brought death and decay into the world, but the genetic decay we see now was just beginning. Their genetic pool was pristine. Because their DNA was perfect, the risks of close relatives having children didn't exist. Genetic diseases often come from two parents passing on the same faulty recessive gene. The reason it's so dangerous today is that siblings are very likely to carry the same rare, harmful genes. But Adam and Eve had no inherited genetic flaws. Their children could marry without any risk of genetic disease. Second, it was just the matter of necessity. At the very beginning, there were no other choices. For humanity to obey God's first command to be fruitful and multiply, the children of Adam and Eve had to marry each other. It was a temporary requirement to get the human race going. Third, and this is probably the most important point, we have to look at when the law was given. The laws forbidding incest weren't given until the time of Moses, about 2,500 years later. You can find them in Leviticus 18. By then, the human population was huge, and the human gene pool had thousands of years to build up mutations, making these unions biologically risky. Plus, there was no longer any need for it. Cain's marriage to his sister wasn't a sin in his time because God hadn't forbidden it. In fact, it was necessary. To judge them by a law that wouldn't exist for another 2.5 millennia is like giving a speeding ticket to a guy on a horse and buggy 1,000 years before cars and speed limits were invented. The context is everything. This leaves one more question. If these daughters were so important, why are they invisible in the story? Why doesn't the Bible even give them a name? The Nameless Daughters. We know from Genesis 5:4 that Adam and Eve had daughters. We know Cain's wife must have been one of them. So why are they ghosts in the story? Why the silence? To a modern reader, this can feel strange. We're used to stories that value everyone's individual story. But to understand the silence, we have to understand the goal of these ancient writings, especially the genealogies in Genesis. The main point of these genealogies wasn't to give us a complete family tree of every single person. Their purpose was much more specific, to trace a single chosen family line through history. They were built to track the line of promise, the seed, that would lead from Adam through Seth, Noah, Abraham, and eventually to the Messiah. Because of this focus, the genealogies are almost always patrilineal, meaning they trace the family through the father's line. This was the cultural standard back then. Inheritance and family name were passed down through the father. The biblical writers used this familiar format for their theological goal of tracing the messianic line. In that system, daughters were usually only named if they played a direct and unusual role in the story of that male lineage. But as a general rule, if a daughter married, her children became part of her husband's family line, and her name was often left out of her father's genealogy. This wasn't about their worth as people, it was a function of the literary style used to track the line of Seth. Adam and Eve's daughters were absolutely essential for humanity's survival. They were the mothers of nations. But because the spotlight in Genesis 5 is so focused on the line leading to Noah, the text just summarizes their existence with the phrase, "He had other sons and daughters," and moves on. We see this pattern over and over. For almost every man listed in Genesis 5, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, and so on, the text says the same thing. And he had other sons and daughters. The Bible confirms they existed, even if it doesn't name them. So the forgotten daughters weren't forgotten by God, and they weren't unimportant. Their stories just weren't the focus of this particular narrative. But to find their names, we have to look outside the Bible, to ancient texts written by people asking the same questions we are. It's amazing how one verse can change the whole story, isn't it? We've seen how the Bible gives us the key, but the story doesn't stop there. Ancient traditions actually gave names to these daughters. If you're enjoying this journey into the details of Genesis, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'd love to hear what you think. What part of this has been most surprising to you? Let me know in the comments. Now let's see what those ancient texts have to say. Echoes in Ancient Texts, the Book of Jubilees. While the Bible stays silent on the names of Adam and Eve's daughters, ancient Jewish readers were just as curious as we are. In the centuries around the time of Christ, other books were written that expanded on the biblical story to fill in some of these gaps. One of the most famous is the Book of Jubilees. First things first, the Book of Jubilees isn't in the Standard Bible. It's what's known as an apocryphal work. But even though it isn't scripture, it's a fascinating historical document from the 2nd century BC. It gives us a window into how ancient people understood their own sacred stories, including the identity of Cain's wife. The Book of Jubilees does something Genesis doesn't. It gives us names. According to chapter 4 of Jubilees, Adam and Eve's first daughter was named Awan, and it states very clearly, "And Cain took Awan, his sister, to be his wife, and she bare him Enoch." There it is, an ancient tradition written down over 2,000 years ago that says Cain's wife was his sister, Awan. This shows that the idea of Cain marrying his sister wasn't just made up recently, it was a common understanding way back in antiquity. The Book of Jubilees goes even further. It says their second daughter was named Azurah. And just as Cain married his sister Awan, Jubilees says that Adam and Eve's third son, Seth, married his sister Azurah.
From their marriage came the righteous line that led to Noah and the eventual survival of humanity. Other ancient writings offer different names. Some rabbinic traditions say Cain and Abel were each born with a twin sister. The conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan names Cain's wife Luluah. Other traditions call her Kalmana. The different names aren't as important as the one thing they all agree on. They all start with the assumption that Cain's wife was his sister. None of them invent a separate race of people. They all work within the framework of Genesis, that all of humanity came from Adam and Eve. These texts are a powerful historical witness that for ancient readers, Cain's wife wasn't a contradiction, but just an unnamed detail in the story. Putting the puzzle together. So let's step back and put all the pieces together. The mystery started with what looked like a major plot hole. Cain suddenly has a wife in Genesis 4. First, we saw that the land of Nod wasn't a foreign country, but a land of wandering, describing Cain's state of exile. This steered us away from the false idea of a separate race of people. Then we found the key in Genesis 5:4, a verse that flat out says Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. When you consider their incredibly long lifespans, you realize the early human population was growing. Cain wasn't alone in the world. He was surrounded by his own rapidly expanding family. This biblical evidence solves the puzzle. Cain's wife was his sister, or maybe a niece. She was another child of Adam and Eve, because there was no one else. This also explains why Cain feared being killed by an avenger. It would have been one of his own relatives. Of course, that forced us to confront the uncomfortable idea of sibling marriage. We saw that this wasn't a sin in its time because of three things. Their genetics were perfect and free of defects. It was necessary for humanity to continue, and God's law forbidding it wouldn't be given for another 2,500 years when it was no longer necessary and had become dangerous. We then saw that the daughters remained nameless not because they were unimportant, but because the Genesis genealogies were focused on tracing the single male line that would lead to the Messiah. Finally, we saw how ancient texts like the Book of Jubilees confirmed this solution. They confidently named Cain's wife as his sister, usually Awan. This proves our solution isn't some modern patch-up job, but an ancient understanding of the text. Once you put all the pieces together, the contradiction disappears. There's no missing race of people. The Bible provides a logical, self-contained, and consistent answer. The mystery of Cain's wife isn't a flaw in the Bible. It's a question that invites us to go deeper. More than just a riddle, the question of Cain's wife has been asked for ages. A small detail that made people question the entire biblical story.
But as we've seen, the answer isn't some wild theory about pre-Adamic races. The answer is right there in the scripture itself, woven into the story. Cain's wife was his sister, another daughter of Adam and Eve. This truth is confirmed by Genesis 5:4, supported by the logic of how a population grows, and affirmed by ancient tradition. What this whole thing really shows is something about how to read the Bible. It doesn't always hold your hand and explain every single detail. Sometimes you have to be a patient detective, read closely, connect the dots, and understand the world it was written in. What looks like a plot hole is often an invitation to dig deeper. And when you do, you don't find a flaw, but a richer and more profound story. The story of Cain's wife is more than just solving an old riddle. It reinforces the truth that all of humanity shares a common origin. It reminds us of God's plan to fill the earth, a plan that didn't stop even after the world's first murder. And it shows us that even in the Bible's silences, in the stories of the Nameless Daughters, there's a powerful message. The answer was never really lost. It was just waiting to be found. Thank you for joining me on this investigation. If you enjoyed this, please like this video, share it with someone who might find it interesting, and make sure you're subscribed for more journeys into the fascinating world of the Bible. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep seeking truth.